Hello everyone. Have you ever considered how a single, shadowy operation, executed in a matter of days, could fundamentally alter the destiny of a nation and set an entire region on a new, more volatile course for the next 70 years? Welcome to the story of Operation Ajax. It begins not in the clandestine meeting rooms of Washington or London, but in the sun-scorched oil fields of southwestern Iran. For decades, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, AIOC, a corporate titan majority owned by the British government, held a near-absolute monopoly over Iran's most precious resource. The terms of its concession, signed in an era of colonial dominance, were grotesquely one-sided. While Britain fueled its navy, rebuilt its post-war economy, and provided its citizens with heating oil, Iran itself received a pittance, a fraction of the profits that paled in comparison to the taxes AIOC paid to the British Treasury. The company was a state within a state. Its main refinery at Abadan, the largest in the world, was a British city transplanted onto Iranian soil. British managers lived in luxurious villas with manicured lawns and swimming pools, while their Iranian workforce, who performed the most grueling labor, lived in squalid, overcrowded slums without running water or basic sanitation. The resentment was a low, simmering fire. It was a national humiliation, a constant, painful reminder of foreign subjugation. Into this volatile atmosphere stepped a man who would become the embodiment of Iranian national pride, Mohammad Mossadegh. An aristocrat by birth, educated in Europe, he was a paradox. A frail, emotional man, often pictured weeping in public or conducting state business from his bed, yet possessed of an iron will and an unshakable belief in Iranian sovereignty. He was a constitutionalist, a democrat, and a fervent nationalist. He saw the AIOC not as a business partner, but as a leech, draining the lifeblood of his country. As he rose through the ranks of the Majlis, Iran's parliament, his voice became the clarion call for a single, radical idea: nationalization. He argued with compelling and often theatrical passion that Iran's oil belonged to the Iranian people. The idea was electric. It tapped into decades of pent-up frustration and gave a name to the nation's deep-seated desire for dignity. In March 1951, the Majlis, swept up in a tide of nationalist fervor, passed a bill to nationalize the oil industry. Shortly thereafter, amid massive popular demonstrations, the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, was compelled to appoint Mossadegh as prime minister. The frail old man in pajamas had triumphed. The British lion had been bearded in its den. For the West, it was an unthinkable act of defiance. For Iran, it was the dawn of a new era. But as the flags of the newly formed National Iranian Oil Company were raised over Abadan, the architects of empire in London began to plot their revenge. They could not, and would not, let this stand. The fire of resentment that Mossadegh had harnessed was about to be met with a storm of covert action, and the world would never be the same. The first moves were diplomatic and economic. Britain was incandescent with rage. Prime Minister Clement Attlee's government, and later the more belligerent Winston Churchill, viewed Mossadegh not as a patriot, but as a thief. The AIOC withdrew all its technicians and managers from the refineries, convinced that the Iranians were incapable of running the complex machinery themselves. They were wrong. Iranian engineers stepped up and, against all odds, kept the oil flowing. London's next move was to impose a crushing global embargo. With its control of global shipping and insurance, the Royal Navy blockaded Iran's ports, ensuring that not a single drop of stolen oil could reach international markets. They took Iran to the International Court of Justice at The Hague, certain of victory. It was here that Mossadegh had one of his finest hours. He flew to the Netherlands to argue Iran's case himself. Frail and aged, he delivered a passionate, eloquent defense of his nation's right to control its own natural resources. He spoke not just for Iran, but for all colonized and developing nations struggling to cast off the shackles of economic imperialism. To the shock and fury of the British delegation, the court ruled that it had no jurisdiction in the matter, as the dispute was between a private company and a sovereign government. Mossadegh returned to a hero's welcome in Tehran. He was Time magazine's Man of the Year for 1951, a global icon of anti-colonial resistance. But the victory was a Pyrrhic one. The British embargo was strangling the Iranian economy. Government revenues plummeted. Shortages became common. The coalition of nationalists, secularists and religious figures that had supported Mossadegh began to fray under the immense economic pressure. The British understood that economic warfare alone might not be enough. As early as 1951, their intelligence service, MI6, began drafting plans for a coup. Their agents on the ground, led by the astute and well-connected Robin Zaina, made contact with disgruntled politicians, sympathetic military officers, and even the Shah's influential twin sister, Princess Ashraf. The initial plan, codenamed Operation Boot, was to foment enough internal chaos and political opposition to force the Shah to dismiss Mossadegh. But the old man, as he was known, proved far more resilient and popular than they had anticipated. He was a master of political theater, using radio addresses and public rallies to rally the people to his side whenever his position was threatened. A major crisis in July 1952 saw him briefly resign over a dispute with the Shah for control of the military. The result was a massive, spontaneous uprising in his favor. For 4 days, the country was paralyzed by strikes and demonstrations. The Shah, fearing for his throne, backed down and reinstated Mossadegh with full powers over the armed forces. The failed July uprising was a stunning display of Mossadegh's popular support and a humiliation for the Shah and his British backers. For MI6, it was a clear sign that they could not topple Mossadegh on their own. They needed a more powerful partner. They needed the Americans. Initially, President Harry Truman's administration in Washington had been sympathetic to the Iranian position, viewing the AIOC's stance as archaic British colonialism. They had tried to mediate a solution, but the British, under Churchill's new government, refused to compromise. The American perspective, however, was about to undergo a seismic shift. The Cold War was reaching its zenith. The Korean War was raging. Senator Joseph McCarthy was fanning the flames of anti-communist hysteria at home. Within this fevered context, the situation in Iran began to look very different to a new set of eyes in Washington. The Truman administration was on its way out, and a new Republican president, Dwight D. Eisenhower, was set to take office in January 1953. With him came two of the most influential and fiercely anti-communist figures of the era, the Dulles brothers. John Foster Dulles, the new Secretary of State, and Allen Dulles, the new director of the Central Intelligence Agency, were not just brothers. They were ideological partners. Both were former partners at the powerful Wall Street law firm Sullivan & Cromwell, which had deep ties to international corporations, including those in the oil industry. They saw the world in stark binary terms, a global struggle between the free world and the monolithic threat of Soviet communism. Nuance was a luxury they could not afford. In their eyes, Mohammad Mossadegh was not a nationalist fighting for his country's dignity. He was at best a naive and reckless old man who was creating instability and, at worst, a willing or unwitting pawn of the Soviet Union. Their primary piece of evidence was the Tudeh Party, Iran's Communist Party. While Mossadegh was a staunch anti-communist himself and had often suppressed the Tudeh, he governed a democracy that allowed them to operate legally. As the economic crisis worsened, the Tudeh's influence grew, particularly among disillusioned urban workers. They organized strikes and demonstrations, adding to the general sense of instability. For the Dulles brothers, the sight of organized communists on the streets of Tehran was a terrifying omen. They genuinely believed that Iran was on the verge of falling behind the Iron Curtain, a domino that would destabilize the entire oil-rich Middle East and hand a strategic victory of immense proportions to Moscow. The British skillfully played on these fears. MI6 representatives presented their American counterparts with alarming and often exaggerated intelligence reports about the Tudeh's strength and Soviet intentions. They argued that Mossadegh's continued rule would inevitably lead to a communist takeover. The choice was simple: act now to remove him or lose Iran forever. The Eisenhower administration, unlike Truman's, was convinced. The decision was made. The United States would join the British in engineering a coup d'etat. The CIA was given the green light. The operation was assigned a new, American-led codename, Ajax. The man chosen to lead it on the ground was Kermit Kim Roosevelt Jr., the grandson of President Theodore Roosevelt. Kim Roosevelt was a quintessential CIA man of his era, urbane, intelligent, and a veteran of the OSS, the CIA's wartime predecessor. He had experience in the Middle East and a romantic sense of adventure, coupled with a firm belief in the righteousness of the American cause. In July 1953, he slipped across the border into Iran under a false identity and set up his headquarters in the basement of the US Embassy in Tehran. He arrived with a suitcase full of cash, estimated to be around $1 million, a vast sum at the time. His mission was to orchestrate the downfall of a popular, democratically elected leader and replace him with a pliable autocrat. The plan he was to execute was multifaceted, a masterclass in covert psychological warfare. The first track was political. Roosevelt and his team, working with their MI6 counterparts, reactivated their network of contacts. They used CIA funds to bribe members of the Majlis, encouraging them to publicly denounce Mossadegh and switch their allegiance. They cultivated relationships with influential religious leaders, a task made easier by Mossadegh's secular leanings. Mullahs were paid to deliver sermons branding the prime minister an enemy of Islam, an atheist, and a communist sympathizer. The second, and perhaps most crucial track, was propaganda. The CIA launched what it called a black propaganda campaign. They hired journalists and editors to plant fake news stories in the Iranian press. Newspapers suddenly began running articles claiming Mossadegh was Jewish, that he was secretly plotting with the Soviets, that he harbored a deep-seated hatred for the Shah and for religion itself. They printed and distributed political cartoons depicting him as a madman selling out his country. The goal was to systematically destroy his reputation, to sow confusion and fear, and to erode the base of his popular support. The third track was the mobilization of street-level force. The CIA hired professional provocateurs and gang leaders. They paid for crowds to materialize on the streets, chanting anti-Mossadegh and pro-Shah slogans. They even paid for one crowd to attack a mosque while shouting pro-Mossadegh slogans in a cynical bid to turn the religious community against him. The final piece of the puzzle was finding a replacement. The chosen candidate was General Fazlollah Zahedi, a veteran military officer with a checkered past. Zahedi was ambitious and known for his pro-Western, anti-communist stance. He had been arrested by the British during World War II for collaborating with Nazi Germany, but in the twisted logic of the Cold War, his fierce opposition to the Soviets now made him a valuable asset. The linchpin of the entire operation, however, was the Shah himself. Mohammad Reza Pahlavi was a young, insecure, and deeply indecisive ruler. He was terrified of Mossadegh's popularity and resented the prime minister's efforts to reduce him to a mere figurehead. Yet, he was also paralyzed by fear of failure. He remembered the July 1952 uprising and was terrified of what the people might do if he moved against their hero. For weeks, Roosevelt's agents, including a high-ranking US general sent specifically for the task, worked to persuade the Shah to act. They flattered him, they cajoled him, and they warned him that if he did not join them, the US might abandon him altogether. The plan required him to sign 2 royal decrees, or firmans. The first would officially dismiss Mossadegh. The second would appoint General Zahedi as the new prime minister. Once the decrees were signed, a loyalist Imperial Guard unit, led by Colonel Nematollah Nasiri, would deliver the dismissal notice to Mossadegh and arrest him. Simultaneously, Zahedi, backed by military units whose commanders had been bought or persuaded, would seize control of the government. After agonizing deliberation, the Shah finally relented. On the night of August 15th, he signed the documents. He then immediately flew to his summer palace on the Caspian Sea, ready to flee the country at the first sign of trouble. The operation was a go. Colonel Nasiri and his convoy of armored cars rolled through the quiet streets of Tehran toward Mossadegh's home. The conspirators were confident. They believed the old man would be caught completely by surprise. The night of August 15, 1953 did not go according to plan. The coup's conspirators had underestimated Mossadegh's own intelligence network and the loyalty of key officers within the military. A leak, likely from a bribed officer who got cold feet, had tipped off the Prime Minister's security detail. When Colonel Nasiri's convoy arrived at Mossadegh's residence, they were not met with a sleeping and unsuspecting household, but with troops loyal to the Prime Minister commanded by the formidable General Taghi Riahi. Nasiri was promptly disarmed and arrested, the Shah's decree of dismissal still in his pocket. The first phase of Operation Ajax had failed, spectacularly and publicly. News of the failed arrest spread through Tehran like wildfire. The Tudeh party, sensing an opportunity, poured its supporters into the streets, tearing down statues of the Shah and his father, Reza Shah. For a moment, it looked as if the CIA's worst fears were being realized. The failed coup was inadvertently triggering a communist takeover. Mossadegh's government radio announced that a coup attempt by the Shah and foreign interests had been thwarted. Hearing the news from his Caspian palace, the Shah panicked. He didn't wait for confirmation or further instructions. He, his wife Soraya, and a handful of aides scrambled aboard his private plane and fled to Baghdad. A day later, he was in Rome, checked into a luxury hotel, telling reporters he was on vacation. To the world, it looked as if he had been deposed, and Mossadegh was in absolute control. In the CIA's Tehran station, the mood was one of despair. The coup had been exposed. Their chosen replacement, General Zahedi, had gone into hiding in a secret CIA safehouse, moving from location to avoid arrest. Their primary asset, the Shah, had abandoned his country and his throne. The operation was a catastrophic failure. In Langley, Virginia, Allen Dulles and his deputies came to the same conclusion. They sent an urgent, coded message to Kim Roosevelt in Tehran. Operation is terminated. You are to cease all activity and evacuate Iran immediately. This was the critical moment. This was where the official history of the coup should have ended. But Kim Roosevelt was not one to accept defeat. Standing in his basement command post, surrounded by the wreckage of his meticulously crafted plan, he made a decision of staggering audacity. He decided to disobey a direct order from the director of the CIA. He cabled back a simple, defiant message. He was not leaving. He still had assets, he still had money, and he believed he could still turn the situation around. He would, in his own words, create his own reality. It was an immense gamble. If he failed, his career would be over, and he would face severe repercussions. But if he succeeded, he would change history. Roosevelt's countermove was born of desperation and genius. He realized the Shah's flight, which seemed like a disaster, could be spun into a powerful propaganda weapon. He immediately used his remaining funds and his media assets to push a new narrative. The Shah had not fled in cowardice. He had been forced into exile by the godless, communist-sympathizing Mossadegh. The illegal decrees Mossadegh's government was publicizing were fabrications. The real decree was the one dismissing Mossadegh. He printed thousands of copies of the Shah's decrees, the very documents that had failed to oust Mossadegh, and distributed them throughout Tehran. He instructed his network of mullahs to preach that the Shah, the nation's divinely appointed leader, had been driven from his homeland by an enemy of Islam. He was transforming the failed coup into a story of loyalty versus treason, of religion versus atheism, of monarchy versus chaos. The key was to create the visual impression of a popular uprising against Mossadegh. The Tudeh party had helped him by providing the images of anti-Shah chaos. Now, Roosevelt would manufacture his own pro-Shah chaos. He activated his network of street-level agents. On the morning of August 19th, just 4 days after the initial failure, the second phase of the coup began. The morning of August 19, 1953 began not with tanks, but with a bizarre procession. A small group of circus performers, weightlifters, acrobats and wrestlers, hired by one of the CIA's chief Iranian agents, burst out of the bazaars of South Tehran and began marching toward the city center. They were paid to be a spectacle, to draw a crowd. As they marched, they chanted pro-Shah and anti-Mossadegh slogans. They were soon joined by other groups of hired toughs, professional agitators and unemployed men from the city's poorest districts, all of whom had been given money from Roosevelt's seemingly bottomless cash reserves. This was not a spontaneous popular uprising. It was political astroturfing, a manufactured mob designed to create the illusion of public sentiment. The initial crowd was small, perhaps only a few hundred. Mossadegh and his government, confident after thwarting the initial coup, made a fatal miscalculation. Seeing the pro-Shah demonstrators as a minor nuisance and wanting to avoid bloody street clashes, they ordered the police and military to show restraint. More critically, Mossadegh, fearing the Tudeh's growing power, had instructed his own nationalist supporters to stay off the streets to prevent any escalation with the communists. This created a vacuum. The only organized opposition to the CIA-funded mob was the Tudeh party, which sent its own members out to confront them. The result was exactly the chaos Kim Roosevelt had hoped for. The streets of Tehran descended into a running battle between pro-Shah and anti-Shah factions. Rocks flew, clubs were brandished, and the city's central squares became a violent vortex of confusion and fear. The CIA's propaganda campaign had laid the groundwork perfectly. Many ordinary citizens, bewildered by the conflicting news reports and frightened by the violence, believed the country was indeed collapsing into civil war or a communist takeover. Roosevelt and his team worked frantically from their embassy basement, monitoring the situation via radio and sending out agents with briefcases full of cash to encourage the crowds and direct their movements. They targeted key infrastructure. The mob, now swelling in size as onlookers were swept up in the momentum, attacked and seized control of Radio Tehran. This was the turning point. Suddenly, the pro-Shah, anti-Mossadegh message was not just being whispered in the bazaars. It was being broadcast across the entire country. The voice on the radio, belonging to a CIA-paid journalist, breathlessly announced that the people of Iran had risen up to defend their beloved Shah, and that General Zahedi's government was now in control. General Zahedi himself, who had been shuttled between safe houses for days, was still in hiding. but the broadcast gave the impression of an accomplished fact. It was a bluff, but a powerful one, aimed directly at the one institution that still held the balance of power: the army. The military leadership was divided and confused. Many were loyal to the constitution, but they were also deeply anti-communist and traditionally loyal to the monarchy. They heard the chaos in the streets, they heard the radio broadcasts proclaiming a new government, and they saw the Tudeh clashing with the pro-Shah mobs. The CIA's psychological operation was working perfectly. They were being presented with a false choice: either back Mossadegh and risk a communist Iran, or back the Shah and restore order. Bribes placed by Roosevelt's agents in previous weeks ensured that key tank commanders and unit leaders were already sympathetic to the cause. As the day wore on, one by one, military and police units that had been passive all morning began to shift their allegiance. They started to intervene in the street fights, but now they were intervening on the side of the pro-Shah demonstrators, protecting them and attacking the Tudeh supporters. Trucks of soldiers appeared, flying the Iranian flag and pictures of the Shah. The tide had turned decisively. The final target was Mossadegh's own home, the nerve center of his government. Late in the afternoon on August 19th, the manufactured uprising transitioned into a full-scale military assault. Tanks that had earlier been confined to their barracks now rumbled through the streets of Tehran, their destination clear: the residence of the Prime Minister. They were joined by truckloads of soldiers and the swelling pro-Shah mob, which had been expertly guided by CIA agents towards this final objective. Mossadegh's home was defended by a small contingent of loyalist troops and a handful of light Sherman tanks. A fierce battle erupted. The attackers unleashed a barrage of machine gun fire and tank shells against the compound walls. For 9 hours, the defenders fought back bravely, but they were hopelessly outnumbered and outgunned. The fighting was intense and bloody, a microcosm of the conflict tearing the nation apart. Inside, Mossadegh and his cabinet ministers huddled together, the sounds of battle growing closer. They knew their position was untenable. Facing the choice between surrender and a last stand that would result in a massacre and plunge the country into full-blown civil war, Mossadegh made his decision. To prevent further bloodshed, he would give himself up. He and his key aides escaped over a back wall just as the main gates were breached, and they sought refuge in a neighboring property. The mob, followed by soldiers, poured into his home, looting and ransacking everything they could find, a symbolic desecration of the man who had, only days before, been the nation's undisputed hero. The next day, Mossadegh turned himself in to General Zahedi's forces. His trial was a foregone conclusion. Accused of treason against the Shah, he was subjected to a show trial in a military court. He used the platform to deliver one last, defiant defense of his actions and of Iranian democracy, but the verdict was never in doubt. He was sentenced to 3 years of solitary confinement, followed by house arrest for the rest of his life. He would die in 1967 in his rural village, isolated and forbidden from being buried in a public cemetery as he had wished, for fear his grave would become a shrine for future nationalists. With Mossadegh neutralized, General Zahedi emerged from his CIA safe house to take his place as Prime Minister. Kim Roosevelt, the architect of the victory, met with him and the newly returned Shah. In one of the most telling moments of the aftermath, the Shah reportedly told Roosevelt, "I owe my throne to God, my people, my army, and to you." The CIA had its victory. Operation Ajax was hailed within the agency as a triumph of covert action, a low-cost, high-impact success that would become a template for future interventions in Guatemala, Chile, and beyond. The immediate American and British objectives were achieved. The Iranian oil industry was effectively denationalized. A new international consortium was formed to manage and sell Iranian oil. While the National Iranian Oil Company formally retained ownership, control was ceded to the consortium. British Petroleum, the renamed AIOC, had to accept a smaller share than before, but for the first time, American oil companies were given a massive 40% stake. The Dulles brothers had not just stopped a perceived communist threat, they had also opened up one of the world's richest oil prizes for American business. The Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, returned from his brief vacation in Rome, a changed man. The trauma of his flight and the nature of his restoration had a profound effect on him. He had been shown that he could not rely on popular support, and that constitutional constraints were a weakness. He returned to power not as a constitutional monarch, but as an absolute ruler, beholden to the foreign powers that had installed him. He was determined never to be vulnerable again. To solidify his rule and crush all future dissent, he, with the help and training of the CIA and later Israel's Mossad, established a new, fearsome internal security and intelligence organization, SAVAK. The legacy of Operation Ajax cast a long and dark shadow over Iran and the wider Middle East. The Shah's rule, which would last for the next 25 years, became increasingly despotic. Flush with oil revenue that now flowed more freely after the 1953 agreement, he embarked on an ambitious modernization program known as the White Revolution. He built roads, dams, and schools, and he championed women's rights, granting them the vote and promoting education. On the surface, Iran appeared to be a beacon of progress and stability, a key pillar of American policy in the Middle East. But beneath this veneer of modernity, a brutal police state was taking shape. SAVAK became a byword for terror. Its agents were everywhere. Dissent of any kind was ruthlessly suppressed. Tens of thousands of Iranians were arrested, tortured, and executed. The prisons were filled with students, intellectuals, artists, unionists, and anyone suspected of opposing the regime. The democratic aspirations that had flourished under Mossadegh were extinguished. Political parties were banned, the press was censored, and the Majlis was reduced to a rubber stamp parliament. For the United States, the Shah was the perfect ally. A stable, reliable, anti-communist autocrat who guaranteed the flow of oil and purchased billions of dollars in American military hardware. Washington turned a blind eye to the human rights abuses, viewing them as a necessary price for regional stability. But for a growing number of Iranians, the Shah was a puppet of the great Satan, the United States. He was seen as a leader who had sold out his country's independence for personal power and who was forcing a Western, secular culture upon a deeply traditional and religious society. The memory of the 1953 coup, when American and British power had crushed their democratically elected government, was never forgotten. It became a foundational myth for the opposition, a festering wound of national humiliation. Resentment against the Shah and his American backers simmered for decades. It united a disparate coalition of leftists, students, secular nationalists, and most potently, the Shia clergy. The clergy, led from exile in Iraq and later France by a charismatic and uncompromising cleric, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, found a receptive audience for their message. Khomeini had been a vocal critic of the Shah since the early 1960s, and he skillfully wove the narrative of the 1953 coup into his revolutionary ideology. He argued that the Shah was an illegitimate ruler imposed by a foreign anti-Islamic power. He called for a return to national sovereignty and the establishment of an Islamic republic. In 1978, the simmering resentment finally boiled over. Mass protests, strikes, and demonstrations paralyzed the country. The Shah, suffering from cancer and having lost his political nerve, vacillated between brutal crackdowns and belated concessions. But it was too late. The revolution had a momentum of its own. In January 1979, the Shah of Iran, the man Kim Roosevelt had placed back on the peacock throne, fled his country for the last time, just as he had done 26 years earlier. He would die in exile a year later. The Iranian Revolution of 1979 was, in many ways, the delayed aftershock of the 1953 coup. The deep-seated anti-Americanism that fueled it was a direct consequence of Operation Ajax. The subsequent 444-day hostage crisis at the US Embassy in Tehran, the severing of diplomatic ties, and the decades of hostility that have defined US-Iran relations ever since can all be traced back to those few fateful days in August 1953. The coup that was meant to secure Western interests and create a bastion of stability in the Middle East ultimately sowed the seeds of a radical revolution that would upend the regional order and create one of America's most enduring and intractable foreign policy challenges.